a bit different. This is a presentation that I did in 2007 at the British Sociological Association Sociology of Religion Study Group, the November study day, which was on religion, spirituality and gay sexuality. And my paper for this is available on academia.edu and also Humanities Commons, and it was included as a chapter in LGBT, sexuality and Christianity, which was edited by Stephen Hunt and is available from, it was originally Ashgate, I think it's Taylor and Francis now. So the piece of research that this is based on was a comparison of queer spirituality in paganism and Christianity to see if you could actually say, because paganism and Christianity are quite different from each other in many ways. So the goal of the research was to say, okay, if the queer spirituality in paganism is more similar to the queer spirituality in Christianity, then the chances are that we can actually say there's a distinct queer spirituality that's its own thing. And when you consider the organizations like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who defy categorization as anything other than queer spirituality, then I think we can probably safely say that it is its own thing, as well as part of its whichever host tradition we're talking about. So I looked at two separate phenomena, as I said. One was going with the flow, and the other one was where people were going against the grain. So, and the going against the grain things were things that were unique to queer spirituality. So clearly coming out, although pagans often talk about coming out of the broom closet, we kind of copied that from LGBTQIA people. So acting up was a huge thing, very important. The gender bending and androgyny, really important aspects. Identifying the divine as queer, thinking about the way that we think about darkness, although that's quite common in paganism, and then talking about subject consciousness and queer theology. All of these were unique to, or semi-unique to queer spirituality. And then the queer Christians tended to really focus on justice and liberation for fairly obvious reasons, and queer pagans tended to talk about the tribe, which is a pagan theme, but tended to be more emphasized in the queer spirituality. And again, justice and liberation is a Christian theme, but it was more emphasized by queer Christians. So a note about the use of the word queer. Some people find this word problematic or difficult. I'm using it in the sense of where it's used in queer spirituality, queer theology, queer theory. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a future slide. Okay, so definitions of queer. One definition of it is to resist normativity, and prior to its use to refer to as a kind of umbrella term for LGBT people, it meant to spoil or interfere, but also it's kind of being outside the norm, off-piste as it were, looking at things from a different perspective, and as a tool for liberation from the heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist, colonialist mainstream stuff. Irshad Manji, who is a queer Muslim activist, defines queer as being unpredictable. So, seems good. As opposed to rigid, absolute, and frankly dull. Queerness is a meta category, so it refers to a lot of different sexualities, sexual orientations and gender identities which are outside of the social norm. And it can also mean a fluid identity, unpredictable. So obviously some LGBT people find the term queer a bit difficult because it was originally used as a slur, and it doesn't necessarily fit with their experience of sexual and gender preference. So obviously your sexual preference and your sexual orientation is normal to you because it works for you. That's so not everybody is comfortable with the term queer. And also it could be seen as essentialist to kind of reify queer spirituality as a category. There is this sort of idea that LGBT plus and queer is somehow special, more spiritual by the very nature of being queer. Whereas it could be that, or it could just be that as people who are marginalized, we have to think about every aspect of our identity and our being. And in doing so, we then arrive at different spirituality as well. That's up to your personal interpretation. So the use of the term queer spirituality is post-AIDS. Really, the AIDS pandemic made people have to develop their own spiritual practices, because if we think, for example, of the AIDS quilt, which commemorated everybody who died of AIDS with a little square on the quilt, and it is a huge quilt, and that was a spiritual practice that was developed. And so back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the AIDS pandemic was in full flow, a lot of families rejected their family members who were dying of AIDS, and some people hadn't even come out to their families, and then they were dying of AIDS. So it was very tragic. And so the gay community had to build their own rituals and their own form of commemoration, because the straight world basically didn't care for the most part. And so there's a lot more detail on this in Randy Connor's Cassell's Encyclopedia of Queer Myth, Symbol and Spirit, which is a very good compendium of queer spirituality and symbols and mythology. It's also the case, another problem with the term sort of queer identity, in Christianity, people tended back in the day to think that, you know, it was okay. The more liberal end of Christianity tended to think, well, it was okay to be queer if you were born that way, but if you make it sound too much like a choice, those people might have an issue with it. So clearly, like, how you perform your identity is different than what is sort of essential core to your being. But obviously it makes your life a lot easier if you can be yourself without having to kind of perform a heteronormative identity. And I think it's worth mentioning that gay and queer are not synonymous with each other. Queer tends to be seen as a bit more radical, a bit more edgy. And, you know, I identify as queer. I'm bisexual. I am non-binary. And queer fits my identity a lot better than the other. So I've never thought of myself as gay. I tend to fit under the queer heading. So looking back into the sort of historical background to all of this, the first challenge to traditional views of gender really came from feminism. So you had the first wave, which was challenging the legal aspects of oppression. So, you know, let's get the vote, let's allow women to own property, let's abolish the idea that men own women. So that was the first wave. And also being able to get a divorce was really important in that first wave. The second wave was about, okay, what do we mean by woman? And so, you know, what are the values that a woman embodies? How do we go about achieving personal liberation? So we've done the legal liberation now, so now let's look at personal liberation. And then the third wave is more about, okay, how do we include other groups that were previously marginalized? So queer people, people of color, and other communities that weren't thought about in the second wave. So the third wave on the whole is much more trans inclusive than the second wave, although there were trans inclusive people in the second wave. And so another very important thing in queer spirituality is the idea of martyrs to homophobia and indeed transphobia. And it's now 2020, and this year it was the Transgender Day of Remembrance yesterday, and this year so far 350 trans people have been murdered, which is horrifyingly high. When we think back, there's also been murders of gay people, and a lot of the trans and LGBT people generally who were killed were often people of color or disabled as well. So there is sort of intersecting oppressions going on here. When we think back over the gay liberation movement, one of the earliest proponents of gay liberation was Edward Carpenter. Then there was the homophile movement, the campaign for homosexual equality, which operated in the 1950s. On the lesbian side of the house, there was the Daughters of Bilitis, which was founded by I never remember the woman's name. It'll come to me, or it might be on a future slide. And also very important, Harry Hay, who was, as well as being involved in the campaign for homosexual equality, the Mattachine Society, he also founded the Radical Fairies. And as I mentioned previously, the AIDS pandemic gave rise to a lot of queer spiritual traditions. So we have healing techniques drawn from a variety of religious traditions. There were celebratory and upbeat funerals, making altars for the dead, trying to find inner peace when, you know, in whole swathes of your friends were cut down by this terrible disease, coming to terms with death. And there was a huge amount of art and poetry and drama in response to all of this. And the practice of acting up, which was basically going out on a protest, performing situationist, dramatic type protests, to highlight the fact that the governments of the day weren't doing anything really to help gay people who were dying in droves of AIDS. And also really important is the development of queer theology, and there's been quite a lot of queer theology developed. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Robin Hawley Gosling, and other really important influential writers. So check out some of the names, because that's a really interesting area. Okay, so looking at the ways in which queer spirituality kind of goes with the flow in the host traditions in which it operates. So in Christian queer spirituality, there tends to be, as I said, a really strong emphasis on justice and liberation. So we have a strong embrace of liberation theology, a big focus on social justice, and obviously having the divine not having a gender or embracing multiple genders is really important in Christian queer spirituality. And obviously, you know, there is mainstream Christianity also says these things, but they are particularly emphasized in Christian queer spirituality. And then looking at pagan themes, the tribe is something that we tend to identify with in paganism generally, but it becomes really important within queer spirituality. And one example of that is the radical fairies, mainstream example, druid groves and tribes. I mean, obviously tribalism can be a problematic concept. You know, none of us belong to any extant ethnic tribes. Like, I'm from the southern part of Britain, and the sort of Iron Age tribe that was in the area I'm from was the Atrebates, but I have no cultural linkage to the Atrebates, so I can't really claim to be an Atrebate. And you know, for heaven's sake, don't go around claiming to belong to an Indigenous First Nation unless you actually have cultural links with that First Nation and they accept you as a member, because that would be cultural appropriation. So, but anyway, I think the tribe is an important theme in queer spirituality. Okay, so things that weren't against the grain of the host traditions. So, like I said, coming out of the closet was a very important moment of self-revelation and emergence from the shadows, if you like. Like, you know, it's a gesture or an experience that, or even an initiatory experience, a rite of passage that allows you to express, this is me in my fullness, this is who I really am. I am gay, I am lesbian, I am bisexual, I am transgender, whichever it is. That moment of honesty and vulnerability is really, really important. And then acting up was a really important thing too, because prior to that, people were, you know, expected to be apologetic for being gay. And now, you know, when going out and acting up, there was that sort of, right, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. That's kind of an example of acting up. So resisting gender normativity by gender bending or being gender fluid or non-binary is also against the grain of both mainstream Christianity and paganism, in that both of them can be really quite heteronormative and cisnormative, and by being expressing your gender in a different way and experiencing your gender in a different way, that is going against the grain of the mainstream, right? Now, darkness, nature, and vulnerability. These are very, very interesting, because Christianity tends to be all about, you know, the light is the good bit, is God, and the darkness is basically the devil. And what's really interesting is that queer Christians actually start talking about the importance of darkness. Like, there's this really good piece written by a gay vicar who is having to you know, stay in the closet if he wants to be a vicar, written in the early 2000s. And he talks about the darkness of Advent, you know, the the vulnerability in the darkness and being waiting for Christ to come and in to be born at Christmas, right? And that's a really unusual way for a Christian to write, in my experience. There's a wonderful piece by Oscar Wilde in which he talks about going and hiding in the darkness of the forest from the horrible homophobic persecution that he experienced, and that nature would accept him and love him and shelter him. And that seems to be a very pagan thing. In the novel Maurice by E.M. Forster, Maurice and his lover Alex Scudder take shelter in the forest from homophobic so-called civilization. So there's a definite theme of going to nature and going into the darkness where it will be safe. And also the idea of being vulnerable to each other is something that's very important in queer spirituality. I think we can safely say that finding the queer in the divine and finding the divine in the queer are two things that would be seen as transgressive in mainstream Christianity, at least, less so in paganism, I think, because we're all about the polytheism, and you know, I think it's relatively uncontroversial, the idea that there might be queer gods. I mean, I guess you'd have to be a real, heterocentric curmudgeon to object to there being queer gods. But nonetheless, there's a strong emphasis on both of these themes, finding the queer in the divine. So looking to the divine and the gods to find queerness in that, and also seeing the immanence of the divine in queer contexts, like down at the local gay bar, or in a gay sex act, right? So making love with another same-sex person is still a divine thing. Another really important thing is the idea of subject-subject consciousness. As in patriarchal relationships, the man is seen as the subject and the woman is seen as the object. And Harry Hay said that in same-sex relationships, each party to that relationship would see themselves as the subject and see the other person as a subject in their own right. So this was a really important idea. And interestingly, there's a feminist who talks about a very similar concept in relation to feminist relationships. And the whole concept of queer theology, the idea that the divine is inherently queer. So like the idea that your existence is focused on spirituality and not on the kind of worldly things that we're expected to focus on, like making money and, I don't know, acquiring more things. That in itself is inherently queer. So but queer, obviously there's a lot more to queer theology than that, but that's the idea that spirituality is inherently queer is part of queer theology. Okay. So yeah, like I said, coming out is a rite of passage. It's an experience of self-actualization. It's a defining life experience. You know, some people are kind of so out that they don't need to actually sort of come out, they're just out. But it's an expression. So some of us who are less obvious have to kind of come out every time the subject comes up, right? And coming out is an expression of honesty and openness, whereas acting up is a radical assertion of queer identity, being so out of the closet that no one needs to ask, getting involved in political activism and refusing to accept heteropatriarchal norms. So acting up says, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. So that. Yes, I realise that I now talked about all of these things in great depth in the introductory slide when I should have waited to look at the individual slides. Anyway, sorry about that. So obviously, as I already said about fluidity of gender roles, one of the things that a lot of queer theology does is to deconstruct gender roles in the Bible and look at the biblical characters who transcend gender or go against gender norms. Ruth and Naomi and David and Jonathan being the most obvious examples, but there are many others. Within paganism, critiquing the pagan concept or the Wiccan concept of polarity as being male and female is basically a huge thing for me, because I spend a lot of time pointing out that male and female are not actually opposite, they're just different, and you can make polarity with any pair of opposites. Critiquing non-inclusive models of deity, rising up against prescribed gender roles, and in occultism and paganism, the concept of the divine androgyne is really important. So the idea that there is androgynous deities out there. And in heathenry, we have Saithra practitioners. So the Saithra practitioner was traditionally seen as penetrated by the gods, and therefore Urgi, which was a slur in the Viking age. But Saithra practitioners were kind of inherently queer, especially if they were men, because Saithra was seen as a women's thing, and if men did it, then they were regarded as queer, basically. So so I was mentioning about the darkness. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said "at one with the forest and the night," and he was talking about how he was going to hide from the homophobes that were persecuting him. The Anglican vicar that I mentioned said that, you know, in his experience, it was very hard for two men to come together in the light, because they had to go to the darkness for protection, because like in the 1980s and 90s when that was written, it was still illegal for men to have sex in a place where they might be discovered by somebody else. So like if you were two men having, prior to the year 2000, if you were two men having sex in a hotel, you could be arrested because that counted as a public place, even if you were in a private hotel room. So there was a whole sort of affirmation, this, you know, when people talk about darkness being equated with evil, there's actually a racist component to that. So a lot of queer theology is about focusing on the positive aspects of darkness, dark sexuality, the idea of the dark continent, dark people, that these are good, inherently good things, and sort of trying to point out the wrongness of dark versus light type dualism. So here's some examples of finding the queer in the divine. One of them is the idea of the queer Jesus. There's lots of art depicting Jesus as queer, including this novel Jesus in Love, which is very good. Marcella Outhouse Reid talks about outing the queer God and liberating God from the closet. If you look at the art of poet Pierre et Gilles, they are French photographers, and I actually included some of their work in earlier slides. It transcends religious boundaries because they do queer saints and they do queer deities, and and their stuff is very beautiful. So if you're not familiar with their work, go look it up. It's a real visual feast. And in paganism, we have the idea of lesbians embracing the goddess, gay men engaging with the green man, and the idea of the divine beloved, which transcends gender. Finding the divine in the queer. One example of that is the idea of 10 spiritual roles, for which were developed by Christian de la Huerta, and there's a great article about them by Tom Moon, who is a psychotherapist. There's also this idea that if queer people are seen as somehow intermediate, like intersex, non-binary, genderqueer, that somehow that makes us uniquely fitted to be intermediaries with the spirit world. It's kind of tenuous, but an interesting idea. Queer archetypes, really important, trying to get away from the kind of very gender binary approach to archetypes and moving towards a more inclusive way of looking at archetypes, and seeing the divine as immanent everywhere, including gay bars and saunas and anywhere else that LGBT people might congregate. Lovely quote from Marcella Althouse-Reid here. Our task and our joy is to find or simply recognise God sitting amongst us at any time, in any gay bar, or in the home of a camp friend who decorates her living room as a chapel and doesn't leave her rosary at home when going to a salsa bar. So there you go. So yeah, I mentioned subject consciousness. So he came up with the idea of radical intersubjectivity, which is the idea of, obviously seeing, rather than seeing other people as objects, we see everybody else as a subject in their own right. And also it's about choosing and exploring your sexuality rather than seeing it as somehow divinely ordained, that your sex and your gender are your sexual orientation and your gender are sort of just a given, that you can actually explore and be fluid as well. So there are some really interesting ideas in queer theology. It can be very similar to liberation theology. It's a radical critique of imposed norms. It tends to be postmodern rather than fundamentalist, and focus on the idea of a queer hermeneutics, which is a way of interpreting the text that looks at it from a different angle and from a queer perspective. So I forget where this quote came from, but queer studies thus represent a paradigm or discursive shift in the way some scholars view sexual identity. Queer studies attempt not to abandon identity as a site for knowledge and politics, but certainly problematized fixed and hegemonic notions of identity. Queer theorists argue that identities are always multiple, hybrid, provisional, or composite, in which an infinite number of identity markers can combine to form new sites of knowledge. For queer theorist Michael Warner, queer is a transgressive paradigm representing a more thorough resistance to the regimes of the normal. So it's all about making sure that we can embrace the different and be fluid and explore and have multiple ways of viewing our identity, rather than having this kind of fixed, you will be this and this is your role, and tough whether you like it or not. So rather than that, it's like, we get to choose. Sounds good to me. So is it meaningful to speak of a queer spirituality? And I would say, yes, it is, because queer spirituality is a distinct discourse incorporating unique theology, theory, practice, art, poetry, and ritual. So it has connections to the wider realm of spirituality and religion, but it also has a unique perspective on spirituality, which stems from the experience of being queer and being marginalized. So maybe if in, 100 years time, when being queer is just, or being LGBTQIA plus is completely normal and unremarked upon, maybe there won't be a distinct queer spirituality, because queerness will not be a separate category, or maybe it won't. Who knows? But for now, because of the marginalization of queer people, queer spirituality is its own distinct thing. So some further reading. So I put the sort of Christian stuff on the left and pagan stuff on the right. This one, God's Beauty Parlour and Other Queer Spaces in and around the Bible, is one of the most entertaining books I've ever read. It is very good indeed. And also honourable mention to Marcella Althouse Reid, The Queer God, Contemporary Christianity and LGBT Sexualities. This is the book that my paper was published in. Men's Bodies, Men's Gods, edited by Bjorn Ransdorfer, I think his name is. Still got that on my bookshelf somewhere. It's very good. Lots of different contributions to that. And there is some pagan stuff in there as well, so that's interesting. Castle's Encyclopedia of Queer Myth, Symbol and Spirit is absolutely outstanding anthology of all things LGBT. Then we have Queer Magic, Power Beyond Boundaries, edited by Lee Harrington and Ty Phoenix Kulistin. It's a fantastic anthology of all different ideas about queer spirituality, and I have contributed to that as well. Then we have my very own All Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca, which talks about queer spirituality and other things to do with Wicca. And Blossom of Bone by Randy Connor, reclaiming the connections between homoeroticism and the sacred. And I haven't read that one, but a number of people have recommended it to me. Okay, and finally, check out my other videos, of which there are lots now. I've got a history of Wicca, and one about inclusive Wicca, Two Chalices Ritual, history of paganism. Check it out. And don't forget to smash that subscribe button, because you know you want to. And finally, check out my most recent books, Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft's Transformation, which are available from the Doreen Valiente Foundation online shop at shop.doreenvaliente.org. Okay, see you next time. Blessed be.